Okay, so get ready because we're going to see this iconic character, Shinji Ikari, in a whole new light today. I have to admit, when you sent over these sources about Shinji Ikari through the lens of the Enneagram, I was hooked. I was
Wow.
really fascinated to kind of dig deeper into this. And for anyone listening who might not be familiar with the Enneagram, it's basically like a system of personality typing, and it's really interesting, especially when you apply it to a complex character like Shinji.
Yeah, and that's what is so great about the Enneagram. It helps us understand why people do the things they do, and even fictional characters. It really can unlock some amazing insights into characters, and especially someone like Shinji, who is, notoriously complex.
Yeah, and these sources really dive deep into Shinji as an Enneagram Type 6, which is the loyalist.
Hmm.
And more specifically, it focuses on the self-preservation subtype. So before we kind of get into the nitty-gritty, can you just explain what makes the self-preservation subtype unique, especially when it comes to Shinji?
Sure. So all sixes share this core fear of being without support or guidance. But the self-preservation six in particular, they seek security above all else. They're afraid of being abandoned and left to fend for themselves, so they try to earn security through being helpful and responsible and appearing non-threatening.
Oh, so that kind of explains a lot about Shinji, right? Like all that apologizing and, the people-pleasing. It's almost like he's trying to preemptively disarm any potential threat. It makes sense, but wouldn't that just be exhausting?
Oh, yeah. It's a constant state of anxiety. And, with Shinji, it's definitely amplified by his childhood trauma.
Yeah, you're talking about his mother's death and, him being abandoned by his father. I always saw those events as tragic, but I never really connected them to his personality in this way.
It's definitely a defining moment for him. Imagine the impact of being abandoned by the one person who should be, your source of safety and protection. It makes sense that, as a six, he developed this hyper awareness of potential threats and like a desperate need to secure his place in the world.
So even piloting the EVA,
Yeah.
right? Like facing those angels, that's somehow tied back to this need for security.
Yeah, think about it. For most people, risking your life in a giant robot would seem, terrifying. But for a self-preservation six like Shinji, the terror of being alone and having no support system might actually outweigh the fear of death. So, piloting the EVA despite his fear, it becomes a way to kind of earn his place and to be valuable and ultimately to survive.
Wow, I never thought about it like that. Suddenly, his willingness to pilot the EVA makes so much more sense. He's not just like a reluctant hero. He's actually being driven by this like deep-seated fear of being abandoned. It's almost like a twisted form of self-preservation.
Exactly. It's a survival strategy born out of trauma.
Yeah.
And the survival strategy extends to his relationships too.
That's what I was just thinking about. Like, his relationships are so complicated,
Yeah.
to say the least. I'm particularly interested in his dynamic with Masato. Like, he seems to crave her approval, but also, like, pushes her away. How does the Enneagram explain that?
Well, self-preservation sixes, they have this push and pull dynamic when it comes to relationships. They long for connection, but they're also terrified of it.
Because they're afraid of being hurt.
Exactly. They fear that getting close will inevitably lead to pain, whether it's, rejection, abandonment, betrayal. So they kind of create this distance to protect themselves. But ironically, it often sabotages the very relationships that they crave. And you can see this with Shinji Masato. He wants her warmth and guidance, but he's also afraid of becoming too dependent on her.
So he pushes her away to avoid the pain of potentially losing her. That's heartbreaking, but also, now that you mention it, like incredibly relatable. I mean, who hasn't pushed someone away out of fear, even if it wasn't the best move, right?
It's a very human struggle, and I think Shinji embodies it perfectly. He's kind of stuck in that cycle of wanting connection, but fearing the vulnerability that comes with it.
And how does this dynamic play out with Rei? She's so emotionally distant, yet Shinji seems drawn to her.
Yeah. That is interesting. I think Rei's emotional distance provides a sense of safety for Shinji. He doesn't have to worry about overwhelming emotions or demands from her. Plus, she seems to need him, which fulfills that core sis's desire to be useful and valuable. But, it's a double-edged sword.
How so?
Well, because Rei is so reserved, Shinji can never really be sure of where he stands with her. And this uncertainty kind of feeds right back into his anxiety and his fear of abandonment.
So even though he's drawn to her because she seems safe, her lack of, emotional expression actually makes him more insecure. Just like a catch-22. And what about his relationship with Asuka? Because she's like the opposite of Rei. She's outspoken and demanding, and their interactions are, well, explosive, to say the least.
Yeah, that's a great observation. Asuka represents both attraction and repulsion for Shinji. He admires her confidence and strength, qualities that he lacks, but her brashness also triggers his fear of conflict and rejection. Remember, self-preservation sixes go to great lengths to avoid rocking the boat.
So he's both drawn to her and intimidated by her. And, there's also the whole good child persona that he kind of puts on. The source material really emphasizes that.
It does, and it's a classic self-preservation six strategy. By being, obedient and agreeable and helpful, Shinji believes he can minimize the risk of being rejected or abandoned. He's constantly trying to earn his place by being the good child. But here's the problem.
That's not authentic.
Exactly. It's a coping mechanism. It's not genuine maturity. And, as we've seen, it doesn't really work.
He still ends up feeling insecure and alone, despite his efforts to please everyone. It's like this vicious cycle.
It is. But before we get, too caught up in the negative, it's important to remember that these patterns are adaptive. They developed for a reason. They helped Shinji navigate a traumatic childhood.
That's a good point. It's not about labeling him as flawed, but more understanding how his past, shaped his present.
Yeah.
And speaking of his past shaping his present, the source material talks about, his difficulty expressing anger. And it connects that to his six tendencies as well, right?
Yeah, it does. And it argues that self-preservation sixes like Shinji suppress their anger because they're terrified of jeopardizing relationships. Like they see any display of anger as a threat to their security. Yeah, that's right. And, for Shinji, who has already lost so much, that fear is magnified tenfold. So, instead of expressing anger outwardly, he kind of turns it inwards.
Yeah.
And that manifests as self-criticism and self-blame and just this persistent feeling of inadequacy.
God, there's that line that always gets me, when he says, I'm so pathetic, I can't even protect myself, let alone anyone else. It's like heartbreaking, because you can just feel the depth of his self-loathing. And now knowing that it's likely tied to, his six tendencies, it just hits different.
Yeah. And this kind of feeds into his dependence on external validation too, right? He's constantly seeking reassurance from others, hoping to kind of prove his worth and alleviate that deep-seated fear of being unloved and unnecessary.
Which, if I'm following correctly, ties back to that core belief that he has no right to be unless he's useful to others. I have to admit that concept really struck me in the material that you sent over. It just feels so much deeper than just having low self-esteem.
It is. It's like a fundamental feeling of unworthiness that drives so many of his actions. He believes that he needs to constantly earn his place, to be helpful and compliant and, not to rock the boat. But no amount of external validation can really fill that internal void.
It's like he's trying to build a foundation of security on like shifting sand. It's never really stable. And speaking of feeling unstable, I'm curious about how his six tendencies play into his decision-making, or rather his indecision. I mean, those scenes where he just freezes up in the EVA, unable to act, they're almost painful to watch, but the source material suggests it's more than just him being a scaredy cat.
Oh, yeah, definitely. It connects his indecision to the self-preservation six's deep fear of making the wrong choice and, losing whatever security they've managed to cling to. So every decision kind of becomes a potential catastrophe in their minds.
So instead of acting, he gets stuck in his head, overthinking every possibility and imagining like the worst case scenario. Yeah. Right? I think a lot of people can relate to that, even if they're not, facing giant monsters on a regular basis. Like who hasn't gotten stuck in, analysis paralysis at some point?
That's something many of us can relate to. But, for Shinji, with that heightened fear of abandonment, that tendency is just magnified. Remember that line, if I do something, it'll only get worse? Like that perfectly encapsulates the self-preservation six's tendency to catastrophize and avoid taking risks.
And that kind of brings us back to his, good child persona. He's so afraid of making a mistake and jeopardizing relationships that he often chooses inaction over action, right? He tries to control his environment by being perfectly agreeable, hoping to avoid conflict and rejection.
Right. He seeks security through compliance, but as we've talked about, it's a strategy that ultimately backfires. It leads to resentment, repressed emotions, and those outbursts where he can no longer contain, his true feelings.
It's like a paradox, right? He's trying to protect himself by being the good child, but it actually prevents him from developing a true sense of self and forming, genuine connections.
Right.
And we can't forget about, the whole giant monster apocalypse situation he's dealing with. It seems like his six tendencies, particularly, his heightened awareness of threat, would be on overdrive in that environment.
Yeah, you're absolutely right to bring that up. It's fascinating how the source material reframes Shinji's constant fear. It argues that this fear, which is often seen as a weakness, is actually a highly adaptive trait for self-preservation, especially in a world like Evangelion.
So it's not just him being a scaredy cat. There's like an evolutionary advantage to being, constantly on edge.
Well, think about it this way. Shinji has experienced, profound loss and abandonment really early in life, and his world has quite literally been shattered. It makes sense that his default setting would be to anticipate danger, both, physical and emotional, like
Wow.
his survival depends on it.
Okay, that makes a lot more sense. It's like his radar is constantly scanning for any sign of trouble. But wouldn't that be exhausting? I mean, living in a perpetual state of high alert.
Oh, it is. And we see the, physical manifestations of that anxiety in Shinji, right? His hunched posture, his hesitant speech, the way he kind of shrinks back from confrontation. And, emotionally, he's hypersensitive to any, perceived rejection, always kind of assuming the worst in others.
Which ironically probably pushes people away, fulfilling the very fear he's trying to avoid. It's like a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Exactly. It's the classic self-preservation six trap, creating distance to protect themselves. But, that isolation only intensifies their fear and insecurity.
And how does his tendency to kind of escape into his headphones and that rich inner world play into this? Because the source material you sent over touches on that.
It does. It suggests that for the self-preservation, Six Fantasy offers a sense of control when the outside world feels, chaotic and overwhelming. And, remember, for Shinji, the real world is literally filled with giant monsters and existential threats. So it's no wonder he seeks refuge in his own mind.
I mean, haven't we all wanted to escape into our own little worlds sometimes, especially when things get tough? But for Shinji, is this actually a healthy coping mechanism?
That's where things get tricky. While understandable, this reliance on fantasy ultimately prevents him from, facing his fears and developing the skills he needs to navigate real-world relationships.
It's like putting a temporary bandage on a much deeper wound. And that wound, as we've discussed, is this deep-seated belief that he has no right to be.
Precisely, and it's this belief that drives so many of his actions right. From his people-pleasing to his fear of expressing anger, he seeks validation from others because he doesn't believe he's inherently worthy.
It's amazing how much we've uncovered about Shinji just by looking at him through this Enneagram lens. It's like seeing it in 3D for the first time.
That's the power of the Enneagram. It provides a framework for understanding the underlying motivations that shape our actions and, the actions of others. And in Shinji's case, those motivations are rooted in a very real and a very human fear, the fear of being alone and unloved.
Yeah, it makes you realize that even his most frustrating behaviors, right, his indecision, his emotional distance, they all stem from this deep-seated need for security. But, the material you shared doesn't just focus on the negative, right? It also touches on the strengths of the self-preservation six.
Yeah, it does. And this is where it gets really interesting because it suggests that even within these, seemingly negative patterns, there's a potential for growth.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more about these six strengths. Like, how do they manifest in Shinji, and how can understanding them help us see his journey in a new light? So we talked about Shinji's fears and how they kind of drive his actions. But what about those six strengths you mentioned? Can you give me some specific examples, especially when it comes to Shinji?
Sure. Well, you know how self-preservation sixes are always on the lookout for threats. That constant vigilance can seem negative, but it also makes them incredibly prepared and resourceful. Like they're the ones with the emergency kit, the backup plan, the meticulously researched itinerary.
So in a way, their anxiety is actually like an asset. It's like having a built-in early warning system.
Exactly. And this preparedness, it can be a lifesaver, especially in those really high-stakes situations. Think about Shinji piloting the EVA, right? He might hesitate and overthink, but he's also constantly analyzing the situation, anticipating the angel's moves, and looking for any advantage that he can get.
Yeah, that's true. He's not just, reacting, he's strategizing. And that attention to detail, that careful planning, probably helps him survive those battles.
Yeah, it does. And beyond preparedness, sixes are also known for their loyalty and commitment. Once they feel secure in a relationship or a cause, they're all in. They'll go to great lengths to protect and support the people they care about.
So Shinji's willingness to risk his life in the EVA, even though he's terrified, could be seen as like an act of loyalty. Like he's fighting to protect humanity, but also to protect, those few people he feels connected to, like Misato and Rei.
Exactly.
Yeah.
His loyalty might stem from, a need for security, but it also speaks to a very deep capacity for caring and self-sacrifice. And remember, sixes are also known for their problem-solving abilities. They're constantly, thinking about what-if scenarios, trying to anticipate potential problems and find solutions.
So all that overthinking isn't always a bad thing. It can actually be pretty useful in certain situations.
Oh, absolutely. Imagine, Shinji in a more mundane setting, maybe like working on a group project or planning a trip. Like his attention to detail and his ability to anticipate potential problems would make him, a really valuable asset to the team. And this kind of brings us to the question of Shinji's growth. Does the material you shared offer any hope for him to overcome these negative patterns and like step into his six strengths?
That's what I'm really curious about. He's clearly struggling, but like, does he have the potential to change, to find a more balanced way of being in the world?
Well, the material suggests that he does, and it outlines a potential path for growth, one that, a lot of self-preservation sixes can relate to.
Yeah.
And it starts with self-awareness. Shinji needs to recognize, how his fear of abandonment is driving his actions and kind of sabotaging his
Which
relationships.
isn't easy, right? Like, it's one thing to intellectually understand, a concept like the Enneagram, but it's a whole other thing to see those patterns playing out in your own life.
Oh, absolutely. It takes honesty and courage and often, the support of others to really confront those deep-seated beliefs and behaviors. But the material suggests that Shinji has moments of self-awareness. Think about the times when he chooses to pilot the EVA, not out of obligation or fear, but because he genuinely wants to protect
Oh,
others.
right. Like when he decides to fight the angel that's attacking Tokyo 3, even though he knows it could be a suicide mission, it's like he's finally acting from a place of inner strength, not just fear.
Exactly. It's a glimpse of his, potential for growth. And beyond, those moments of action, there are times when he starts to challenge that core belief that he has no right to be.
Can you give me an example? What does that look like for him?
Remember when he finally confronts his father and expresses, his anger and resentment? Like, that's a huge step for a self-preservation sex. He's risking rejection and abandonment to speak his truth. And even though it doesn't magically solve all his problems, it's a sign that he's starting to move away from, that need for constant approval and validation.
So he's taking those steps towards self-acceptance, even if they're small and sometimes messy.
Exactly. Growth isn't linear. There will be, setbacks, moments when he kind of falls back into old patterns. But as long as he keeps questioning, those limiting beliefs and keeps striving for genuine connection, keeps acting from a place of courage, even when it's terrifying, he has the potential to break free from that cycle of fear and find a more authentic way of being.
And what about his tendency to escape into fantasy? Is that something he needs to give up entirely? I mean, it's understandable given his circumstances, but, we've talked about how it can also be a barrier to real connection.
Right. The material suggests that imagination and creativity can be powerful tools for sixes. It's all about channeling them in a way that supports growth, not hinders it.
So instead of using fantasy to escape reality, he could use it to explore, his inner world, to confront his fears, to imagine new possibilities for himself.
Exactly. And that's where, therapy and creative expression and supportive relationships can play such a crucial role. Shinji's journey, while unique in its context, really speaks to a universal human struggle. We all have fears and insecurities and coping mechanisms that hold us back, but, we also have the potential to heal and to grow and to find a more authentic way of being in the world.
Wow, this deep dive has been incredibly eye-opening. It's given me a whole new understanding of Shinji, but also of myself and the people in my life.
Yeah.
I can definitely see how the Enneagram can be such a powerful tool for self-discovery.
Yeah, that's the beauty of it, isn't it? It helps us move beyond, those simplistic judgments and see the deeper motivations behind people's actions, both, our own and those of others.
It's like you said at the beginning, it's about understanding the why.
Mm.
And that understanding can be so liberating. It opens up new possibilities for, empathy, compassion, and growth.
And isn't that what we're all striving for? To understand ourselves and each other a little bit better, to find the courage to face our fears and step into a more authentic and fulfilling way of being.
Well said. This has been a fantastic deep dive. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise and for helping us see Shinji Ikari and ourselves in a whole new light.
Oh, it's been my pleasure. And for all of you listening out there, keep exploring. The journey of self-discovery is ongoing, and, the Enneagram is a wonderful tool to guide you along the way.
Until next time, keep diving deep.